Chapter 7 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Calkins. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 7. Sunrise off Branscomb Head. More than merely one of those men of substance who had watched the launching of the Jocasta had not been able to see her slip down the ways and take the sea without feeling a stirring within him and a sudden revulsion against the cautious policy which he had been following. Massachusetts had always been the foremost trading colony. It would never do to see her lose her place. In spite of themselves, their minds began to linger and dally upon the dream of overseas commerce once again. The warnings and prophecies of Darius Corland began to lose their potency. Perhaps this sea adventuring is not really the rich man's sport which we have considered it, the merchants began to speculate to one another, and there were several into whose hearts had stolen the thought, if a young boy and a broken man can get so fine a vessel as the Jocasta to sea, it may be that even a careful man of business might think of doing likewise. They say that there is tobacco in Virginia and iron in Pennsylvania, for which the markets of Massachusetts are crying aloud. Somehow it came about that the post-rider began to bring to Nicholas scattered letters from seaport towns up and down the coast. Could he undertake repairs and refitting of such and such a vessel, built during the war for a privateer, and now idle, but able to be a possible profit in the coastwise trade? He could. Many of these inquiries came to nothing, but little by little there dribbled into the Drury shipyards a very small portion of their once thriving trade. A bark which had been a French prize was put in order for a man who purposed to bring pig iron from the mouth of the Delaware. A topsail schooner was made ready for the sea for an even bolder spirit who thought that he might try buying cotton in the South to carry to Boston. The rebuilding and the refitting made slow, unexciting work of no very great profit, but they marked the first reward for that bold stroke of laying the keel of the Jocasta in a troubled time when men's faith in ships was gone. It kept the men busy and safe from pressing want, but it afforded a scarcely visible surplus for the fallen Drury fortunes. Nicholas toiled long and earnestly to accomplish the work efficiently and at a price reasonable enough to tempt timid venturers into greater undertakings. When the Jocasta once comes home again, he kept promising himself, then all men will know that it is not merely the few and great who dare hazard their substance upon the sea. Over and over he counted the time which must pass before the return of the ship. A month for the West Indian portion of the voyage, 2 more before she could reach Gibraltar, 3 or 4 to be spent trading in the Mediterranean, at the very most 8 or 9 months before they might count on her return. It would be the high tide of summer when they might look to see her again. Nicholas could see just how she would look, standing in from Branscomb Head, beating up the harbor with good fortune for them all stored safe within hold, and with glory for her country in the record she had left behind her. But they must all buckle their courage tight to endure through the long waiting. The winter was upon them, yet with sufficient open weather to allow the work to proceed. The whole country was throbbing with uneasy excitement, for one colony after another was weighing the question of the new government, and half the people were vowing that they must, and the other half that they must not, join together in the final union there laid down. Through all of January and February, Massachusetts rocked with the argument as to whether this important state should lead a number of smaller waiting ones into the great step of ratifying the Constitution. "It will be the beginning of a magnificent era of history," proclaimed one set of orators. "It will be the end of all stable things," proclaimed others with equal vehemence. "Men cannot change their governments as they change their coats." Amid all this turmoil, it was not to be marveled at that commerce took no great strides forward. Yet still the hammers of the Branscomb shipwrights worked steadily through the winter and into the spring. Only once had news of the Jocasta come back to her company of owners, but "she has gone on a long voyage," they said to each other, and forbore to speak other than cheerfully. By February, Massachusetts, with some misgivings and reservations, had stepped cautiously into the Federal Union. The loud talk that the South might make a confederacy of its own began to die away. It was midsummer night when bonfires lighted on all the hills and bells ringing in all the church spires proclaimed that the majority of colonies had accepted the new Constitution, and that government of the people, for the people, and by the people was assured. Not since those same bells, 12 years before, had pealed out the proclamation of liberty and independence, had any message of such great import been declared to the world. New Hampshire had been the deciding state to join, but Nathan Stiles, the post-rider, galloping southward with the great news, passed the dusty northbound messenger who bore the great tidings that Virginia, too, stood with the rest. It was late autumn before the last little state slipped into her place. But meanwhile the wheels of stable government had slowly begun to revolve. History has shown us, in the bloody and appalling records of the French and Russian revolutions, what can happen when liberty-seeking people cast away their old government and fail to agree upon a new one. The whole nation of the United States must ever be grateful to those minds who planned and wrought our Constitution, but it must also offer honor to many unnamed upholders of order and peace, who kept their hearts true and their heads steady while the tremendous changes were going forward, who looked with hopeful courage into the future rather than let themselves fall into blind panic during the confusion of the present. Spring had stepped through the doorway of summer, when there came one day a surprising visitor to the counting-house to ask for Nicholas Drury. A man of courteous and dignified manners it was, with the ruddy face of a sailor, the bearing of one who could be no less than the commander of a ship, and the accent of speech which spoke him plainly as a subject of King George. When he and Nicholas were established in the small private room, where the windows stood open to the heat of the late June morning, the stranger drew from his pocket a letter which he put into the boy's hand. "I was asked to see that this came safely to you, and since it was given to me by one whom I greatly regard and honor, I came over the miles from the port where my ship lies, that I might deliver it to you myself." Nicholas broke the seal, glanced at the brief page of unfamiliar writing, then smiled over the name at the end as one does on catching sight of the face of a long unseen friend. It was from Etienne Bardot. He looked up inquiringly at the messenger, who had given his name as Captain Hart, of the British ship Northumberland, of the port of Liverpool. "You had it from Etienne Bardot himself? You know him?" he asked. The other nodded. "I know him well, and all of his hopes and ambitions. Englishmen love liberty as part of their nature, and I am one of those who respect the men who are striving to bring liberty where tyranny has stood so long. I have given Etienne Bardot passage on my ship more than once. We have talked of his adventures and escapes, and we have talked of you. As I have come along the way, I have heard news of you in the speech of the people, fellow travellers in the coaches, or men whom I have talked to at the inns. I have learned what it is that you have undertaken. I offer you my congratulations and my great hope that you will succeed. You have had good news from your ship, I trust?" "No," Nicholas answered. We had a message from the West Indies when they had first arrived at Port-au-Prince, and sent word back by a northbound French brigantine. That was in December." "December? And this is June. And since the first time you have heard nothing?" exclaimed the English captain. Nicholas shook his head. "Nothing," he affirmed. His voice was dry, so that the difficult word would scarcely pass. The man seemed to be looking backward over the memory of past months. "The Jocasta. Did I not hear that she was so named, and bound for Mediterranean ports? I have touched at some myself. Marseilles, Barcelona, and Palermo, and nowhere have I heard sailors speak of her. News of an American ship in those unvisited ports ought to run fast and far." Nicholas got up from his place and went to stand looking out the window. The hot glitter of morning sun was upon the smooth sea, streaked here and there with chance ripples, but mostly colorless as it always is before the slanted rays of afternoon have brought out its fathomless shades of blue. "There are many reasons why we may not have got tidings of her," he declared bravely, as he had so many times before within himself. "I look for the Jocasta to come safely to port within a month or two, just the same." "You are right, sir," agreed the Englishman earnestly. "The chances of the sea may easily have carried word astray. You will see her swing into the harbour mouth in her own good time. With all my heart I wish you the best of fortune for her." Nicholas turned about, surprised. "There are not many of your country," he observed, "who have offered us just that wish." "There are more, perhaps, than you know," the other answered him. "Men are of many different opinions in these changing days. There are some, it may be, on this side of the Atlantic who call themselves Americans, who still hope that your country will not go forward in progress and success, while there are those of us who are watching you across the water, who know that it is by just such ventures as yours that the United States will establish herself in honor before the eyes of all the world." In the cool shadiness of the little room he looked squarely across at Nicholas with the glance of one man who understands the courage and ideals of another. "Although your years are not great, I will ask you to think of this. If a man has an elder son who goes out into the world to make his own fortune, does not the father always hope that the lad will acquit himself well before all men? The war between us is over and settled. There is kinship between our countries still, and in the hearts of many of us is the thought that there will be a special sting in your doing ill, a special pride in your coming to success and honor." He must return to his ship, he told Nicholas, who urged hospitality upon him. But first he was persuaded to take his way to the Blackbird Inn, where he sat talking for an hour with Thomas Drury. The sick man brightened in the stranger's company, and the two exchanged anecdotes of voyages in his uncle's past, about which Nicholas had scarcely known. He wondered to hear them letting fall the names of ports of which he had only vaguely heard: Kronstadt, Algeciras, and Cumana. At last the new acquaintance was forced to take his leave, and rumbled away in the southbound coach to rejoin his ship. After he was gone, Nicholas drew forth once more the letter which he had given so hasty a perusal. In the little room at the back of the inn, beside the window where Etienne Bardot had first looked in upon him, he sat down to read his message through again. "My dear distant friend," it began, "as I go up and down the world, I wonder many times how it has fared with you and that red-haired child of impulse, who, I am convinced, has now become your esteemed and trusted comrade. Those winds of destiny, of which I told you, can already be felt beginning to blow across our land, but the real tempest is not yet come. In a year, it may be those thunders and lightnings will commence to play which are to usher in French liberty. In the course of that year, it is my earnest hope chance may cast me upon your shores again, and I may see you and that erstwhile and well-beloved companion of my wanderings, Michael Slade. Your unforgetting friend, Etienne Bardot. Nicholas refolded the paper slowly. It had meant much to hear news of his French friend, but the sight of that letter had aroused such a leap of hope that here might be tidings of Michael and the Jocasta that the disappointment was almost beyond bearing. He felt sick and shaken, and his fingers trembled as he laid together the folds of the crackling paper. Even after he had seen that it was from Etienne, he had still felt a wild belief that there was word of Michael in it, that these two had somehow found each other in those crowded ports beyond the Atlantic. But there was nothing. The letter was as empty of the desired news as that grey stretch of water beyond the window was bare of a single sail. Dolly, coming suddenly in at the door, saw him standing there with the letter in his hand. Is it from Michael?" she cried. Then, as Nicholas shook his head, she buried her face in her hands and burst into a flood of tears. Only once or twice since she had been a small child had her brother seen her weep. He put a steadying arm about her and sought to offer comfort. "We will hear of them yet," he asserted steadily. "We have only to wait a little longer." He took courage and hope himself in the effort to ease her terror. The summer passed with the Jocasta long overdue. The autumn came, and she had been gone a year. Men talked of her as missing rather than as a vessel whose return was still to be expected. The autumn wore slowly by, and a cold, blustery winter dragged lengthy months over those who still in their hearts stoutly maintained that they were only waiting. By the time the summer was again at hand, work had begun to lag greatly in the Branscomb yards. In other places, business and trade were beginning slowly to come to life again, but here, where the first forward impetus had been felt, even such small prosperity as they had once had was slipping away. "Your efforts seem to be unlucky," grinned Joseph Ryle when he met Nicholas upon the street corner one day. Kind little Mr. Hollister had sought to comfort him, but his own attitude had been of one who had completely abandoned hope, so that his words had been of no help. The grim look upon the face of Henrietta Sparrow was something terrible to see. Nicholas knew well that where once the launching of the Jocasta had won an increase of prosperity, her non-return was now driving it away. "Just sailed off and was never heard of again," he heard a merchant from Melford saying to a traveller from a more distant town, as they dismounted together one day before the Blackbird Inn. Then, seeing that Nicholas was coming out through the door, the first one stated his business at once. "It was to see you, Mr. Drury, that I have ridden hither. There was some talk of your refitting a ship for me, but I have reconsidered the matter. I find it can be done to somewhat better advantage elsewhere." Even in his smarting disappointment, Nicholas realized that it was out of friendship for him and for Thomas Drury that the man had come in person to tell him what he had decided. Other messages of the same nature, but more abruptly worded, had reached him by letter. The tongue of Darius Corland was beginning to be very busy. Again Nicholas began to be conscious, as he had been at the commencement of his great undertaking, that beyond that small region in which he lived, an unyielding wall of doubt and disbelief hemmed him in on every side. Michael, perhaps, might have done something to convince and persuade, so he often reflected, but at the thought a stab of agony would go through him, for the essence of the tragedy was that Michael was not at hand. Knowing that he was of little worth at the task of cajoling doubtful merchants, Nicholas made no effort to counteract that talk which Mr. Courland and Mr. Ryle were so industriously spreading abroad. It seemed as though Darius Courland had at last become convinced that it was not Nicholas's purpose to use his letter against him, and had taken courage. He had made no further effort to recover the missive, nor had that curious pair, Hezekiah and his long companion, ever shown their faces in Branscomb again. Mr. Courland, with reviving assurance, was doing his utmost for the further undoing of the Drurys, uncle and nephew. With the property which he had purchased added to his former holdings, he was beginning to be looked upon as one of the great landed men of the state. His word carried weight wherever it went. Besides a scant succession of fishing vessels brought to Branscomb for repairs from time to time, Nicholas had upon the stocks a stout, chubby little brig, which her owner had entrusted to him for rejuvenating after long neglect. "Her bottom has not been cleaned for half a lifetime," Caleb Harmon commented in righteous scorn for one who would thus ill-treat so valuable a thing as a ship. "The growth upon it is so thick that it looks like Widow Stone's garden. I declare I find myself looking amongst the barnacles and weeds for gillyflowers and mignonette." When the planks were finally scraped clean, the state of the hull was found to be so bad that far more rebuilding was needed than the owner had planned. He came to Branscomb, a round little man not very different from his vessel, to protest and argue the matter with Nicholas. "Cannot you go forward and do only the work for which we had arranged?" suggested this Mr. Rufus Craythorpe, through whose fingers money passed with extreme reluctance. "If she should put to sea with only such repairs, she would be safe neither for men nor for cargo," Nicholas insisted. "We cannot have part in any such inadequate refitting." At this Mr. Craythorpe raised such a storm of protest, such an outcry that he was being betrayed by unfair means, that Nicholas's hard-worn patience could scarcely stand steady. "I will make you an offer, Mr. Craythorpe," he said at last. "I will buy the brig from you as she stands upon the cradles, and will refit her as my own undertaking." He knew that she had the makings of a good ship, although a very slow one, and he felt that it should be possible to sell her when she was ready once more for sea. Since there was no other work in view, he thought that the situation was desperate. "But the money?" questioned Mr. Craythorpe. "Where will you get the money for buying her? All the world knows that you have no surplus, and that your work here, since you lost your vessel, has merely been going on from hand to mouth. It is well known that you are no judge of the seaworthiness of a ship." Nicholas flushed. He knew who had proclaimed abroad that news. "I will give you a mortgage on the shipyard," he said. Since he and his uncle had been freed of that former load of debt, he had vowed that they would never incur new ones. But with the thought of bringing his work to an end and dismissing his men to the bitter poverty of winter, he felt that a moment had come for drastic remedy. To his offer, however, Mr. Craythorpe shook his head. "If you should not be able to pay me, and I am certain that you will not, would it be of any use for me to hold possession of an idle shipyard? And idle your place will be, that we are all certain. Idle and ruined before another year is out." No round little man with a heart of flint should be allowed to see what Nicholas felt at that suggestion. For very defiance he could not go back. "Then we will lay the debt upon the property of the Blackbird Inn," he persisted steadily. Mr. Craythorpe brightened eagerly. "That would do very well indeed," he agreed. "An excellent bit of property, and well situated. When I once get it into my hands, I will extend the buildings." "It is not yet yours," Nicholas interrupted him. "But only if I fail to pay my debt." Mr. Craythorpe's spirits seemed not in the least cast down by this idea. He evidently considered that his hold on the Blackbird Inn would never be loosened. The matter had to be discussed with Thomas Drury, who was able now to take more part in his affairs, but who still looked upon Nicholas as the single active partner. He gave his consent, his opinion agreeing with that of Nicholas, that work should go forward at all costs. The slow revival of colony-to-colony trading made it seem that good use could be found for the little brig Betsy. Mr. Craythorpe travelled back to his own town, smiling broadly, and obviously feeling that he had done a very shrewd day's work. "A cantankerous job," Caleb Harmon called the task of putting the Betsy in order. But by slow patience it was finally brought to an end, although not before spring had passed into summer. When the meadow larks were once more announcing that it was time for the oak timbers to come rolling down the muddy roads out of the north country, Ephraim Havergal sent word that the winter had been so stormy and snowbound that he had little to send this year. Much later in the summer, Nathan Stiles brought the message, "If you are to lay a new keel before winter, Eph will put by his haying to get the oak out for you." Nicholas received the offer in silence. What heart could he have for laying down a new vessel now? The fortunes of the Drurys were at their lowest ebb, and he was at the very end of his resources. The brig was in the water, as seaworthy as a duck, but with no greater degree of beauty or speed than was possessed by that practical barnyard fowl. Nicholas had sent out word to various merchants stating that he wished to sell her. Nathan Stiles, along with his message from Ephraim, brought him a handful of letters which must probably contain answers which would decide the future of the plump Betsy. After the post-rider was gone, he sat himself down in the inner counting-room to read them. There are various methods of saying no, some kindly, some unconsciously cruel, some deliberately insolent. By the time he had finished his letters, Nicholas had become familiar with them all. It was really true, it seemed, that no man cared to take his word for the seaworthiness of a ship. He sat beside the table, very quiet, with all the place empty about him. As it had been on that February morning when he had seen the footsteps under the plum trees, it now appeared that he was friendless, desperate, and had no one to whom he might turn. What a long circle of hope and sorrow he had followed to return to the same place! One letter, the last which he read, had offered a mere crumb of compliance with his request. Mr. Craythorpe would not consider being again owner of the Betsy, but he would charter her for a certain sum. He had chanced to make a purchase of oil from a whaling fleet, and was minded to send a cargo of it to the Carolinas. The amount which he offered was the veriest pittance, determined, so Nicholas knew, by his knowledge of how hard-pressed was her owner. He sat pondering the question of acceptance, thinking so deeply that he did not hear any approach down the long outer room. Indeed, no matter how alert he had been, he might not have heard, for these footsteps made scarcely any sound. He looked up quickly, however, when the door creaked softly, and the head of a man was thrust inside. Only twice before, and then very briefly, had he actually seen the face of that man who was called Hezekiah Truman, because it was not his name. He recognized at once, however, the half-bold, half-cowering expression, and had no doubt as to who this visitor might be. They stared at each other for a considerable space of time, since Nicholas would not trouble himself to be the first to speak. "Do you pass me your word not to call the watch if I come in?" the newcomer finally inquired cautiously. "I do," Nicholas agreed. "There was an occasion when you might have blown my head off with your blunderbuss, and your heart failed you. For that you shall enter." As the man stepped inside and closed the door, he asked further, "Where is your long-legged comrade? Did he not dare to come?" "Oh, it was not that. Tom Travers stops at nothing," Hezekiah responded. "He and my employer have had a little falling out. They have never agreed as well as they should." "So you come as before from Darius Corland, and not from Etienne Bardot?" Nicholas asked. The other laughed shamefacedly. "It is true that I have not always myself agreed with the man I serve, and that I owed gratitude to Mr. Bardot which I once sought to repay. Yes, I come from the same man as before. I beg you, sir, to mention no names. It is verily not wise. Tom Travers taught me that, while we were still comrades." Nicholas could not forbear smiling at his awkwardness. "Then you had better drop the name of Tom Travers from your talk," he suggested. "It is my belief that the fellow is as desperate a rascal as walks the earth, and no proper company for a careful man like you." So I thought myself," agreed Hezekiah eagerly, whereupon Nicholas laughed aloud. The other, not in the least abashed, stated his errand. "He who has sent me," he began, as though the words had been learned by heart, "refers to a certain paper which is in your possession, over which you may remember there has been some negotiation already." Nicholas nodded. "He bids me tell you that he is now prepared to purchase that letter from you, and is ready to offer you a good round sum, which, at the present juncture, may not come amiss to you. I was to emphasize especially that matter of the amount. It is to be subject to discussion with you, and very generous in its size, but I do not know how to emphasize it more than simply to say it again, a good round sum." "And how much of it were you to get for your share in the arrangement?" Nicholas inquired. Hezekiah shook his head and closed his lips firmly. He was not to be caught unawares and laughed at again. But since the boy beside the table said nothing more, he finally said, "I was not to come away without an answer." "I am very weary of the whole affair," Nicholas returned. It seemed impossible to take this insignificant messenger seriously. "You had better tell Darius Corland that if he wishes to treat with me, he will have to come himself." Very good, sir. I will tell him. All I wanted was to have an answer of some kind." And Hezekiah, doubtless very glad to get his errand safely performed, vanished through the door as noiselessly as he had come. Nicholas gathered his papers together. He had spoken only in jest, and now he dismissed the visitor from his mind. There were more vital things to demand his attention. He must get out the accounting for the brig Betsy, and calculate how great the loss would be on her if he were to accept Mr. Craythorpe's mean offer. He fetched the papers from the locker on the wall, but before he turned back to the table, stopped to glance up at the drawing of the Jocasta which hung above the cupboard. He stood there studying it long and carefully, every line, every detail of her design. Was there anything here which could have caused disaster? Any fault or flaw in the workmanship of her building? Anything in which he must blame himself for that heavy weight of tragedy which had settled down upon them all? He stood there for he knew not how long, slowly gathering comfort as his eyes travelled from the counter of her stern to the eagle figurehead under her bowsprit. Whatever he might doubt about himself, his courage, his wisdom, his worth in the world, this work of his mind and his hands he could not doubt. The Jocasta had not betrayed to their undoing those whom she had carried across the seas. Her disappearance was from some other cause. He was only drawn from his contemplation by the sound of the doors opening once more. It was Darius Cornland who stood upon the threshold. Not since that day at the Blackbird Inn, more than 2 years before, had Nicholas held speech with this man. Once or twice he had seen him driving through the streets, and he had caught a distant glimpse of him on the day of the launching. He was startled now to see what changes had come about. That handsome, high-colored face looked drawn and flabby. The free stride, with its hint of swagger, had grown heavy and lagging. Very slowly, and without speaking, Mr. Cornland walked across the room and sat down in the chair which Nicholas placed for him. The boy seated himself on the other side of the table and waited for his guest to say why he had come. The words spoken to Hezekiah had never been meant seriously. The last thing in the world which he had looked for was that Darius should actually appear. They sat very still for a little, with only the sound of the washing tide breaking the quiet in the little room. The sunshine, reflected from the water outside, ran across the ceiling in shimmering ripples of brightness. At last, Darius Cornland spoke in a voice as changed and broken as was his whole aspect. "Nicholas," he said, "I was your uncle's friend." It was fairly pitiful to see the big, overbearing man actually pleading. But there were memories to harden the boy's heart. "He called you his friend once," he agreed, "but it is long since you ceased to make even a pretense of being that. When his fortunes began to fail, you were certainly his friend no more." "No," he corrected himself. "It was even earlier than that. It was before the British came and scuttled our ships beyond the harbor. We owe that, I hear, to you." Darius winced. "That is long past now," he declared. "The war is over. Is it not time to put old grudges away? And I will offer you anything that you could wish, if you will do as I desire." "Can you give us back our good name, which you have toiled so long to take away?" the boy asked bitterly. "Yes, even that," returned Darius with eagerness. "With me behind you instead of against you, there is every promise that you would go far." "I should not greatly care to go far in your manner of going," observed Nicholas dryly. He was wondering how anyone could ever have been in awe or fear of this man. Certainly he would never be so again. Once more Darius bent himself to pleading. "Of what use will it be to you," he asked, "to ruin my standing among my fellow men, to cast me down from the place which I have managed to win?" "I have not done that," Nicholas replied, "nor have I even threatened to do so." "No," responded Darius Cornland, "but every day that goes by I live in wonder as to whether you will, and how soon. No man can endure long under such strain." It was quite true that the 2 years of uneasy wonder, of never feeling safe, had broken him as 20 of ordinary life could not have done. In spite of himself, Nicholas felt pity for the man opposite, fallen from his high estate to the actual point of begging for mercy. He weighed within himself the question of giving back the letter. It was of no real value to him. He had no wish ever to make use of it. But Etienne Bardot, on putting it into his hands, had declared expressly that it should not be delivered to its author, that whatever was its fate, it was not to be returned to him. Until he should see Etienne again, and be absolved from that agreement, he could not, in justice, give up the paper. As these thoughts were passing in his mind, Darius Cornland watched him with straining eyes, looking for hope or assent. "I would give it to you," Nicholas began, and the color leaped to the man's face. "But on account of a promise, I do not feel at liberty to do so." Darius had leaned forward in his chair, but now he sank back again, with the black tempest of disappointment and rage gathering upon his heavy countenance. Nicholas went on. "It is possible that I can be freed from the pledge I gave, perhaps sometime within the year." "What lying and quibbling is this?" snarled the man opposite. "Do you think I can believe that? You are holding out for a greater reward, are you? You think to make me purchase my letter dear? Who are you to make terms? All the world knows how near you are to beggary. You should snatch at anything to save yourself. Tell me your price, and have done." His old commanding habit had been too much for him, and with rage and terror he had lapsed into it once more. Nicholas stood up, white-faced with his own anger, but managing still to speak quietly. "You may be gone from here," he said. "There is nothing further that you can say. You have won everything you own by riding over the wills of others. This thing you cannot win." Darius rose also and took a step toward him. "Do you think you can take the letter from me by force?" Nicholas pursued. "I am the younger of us, and the more alert. Time and good living have not dealt kindly with you, Darius Corlund, and you cannot rob me of it by other hands, for you can no longer even hire ruffians to do your bidding." The last shrewd guess had gone home, for Darius reddened in helpless fury. "We will see," he thundered, as he went to the door. "You think I am powerless? Oh, you shall see." He strode out, closing the door with an echoing slam that fairly shook the wooden walls. His heavy feet went down the long room and were lost to hearing outside. Almost before he was gone, Nicholas had taken up his pen to write acceptance to Mr. Craythorpe's offer of chartering the Betsy. In one respect, Mr. Darius Corlund had spoken something very like the truth. The Drurys were so near to beggary that they should snatch at, almost, anything to save themselves. It happened that Mr. Rufus Craythorpe was in haste to get his cargo to market before winter began, and therefore had the oil brought round by lighters while the Betsy was receiving certain final touches at the rigging dock. The heavy casks of spermaceti oil were being lifted, swung inboard, and stowed in the forehold, the after space being kept clear for goods to be picked up on the southward voyage. "If she is not ready to sail by the middle of September, I will cancel the agreement," threatened Mr. Craythorpe, who knew well that she would be, but enjoyed taking a domineering attitude now that he had at his disposal, by such a clever bargain, a really seaworthy ship. It was not patience, but merely weariness, which brought Nicholas to answer so calmly. "We will have all ready. The captain and the crew may come aboard on the 14th. It was the evening of the 12th of September that, after giving the Betsy a final inspection, Nicholas pronounced her preparation complete. Old John Ewing, for whom there had been no shipwright's work lately, was put in charge of her as watchman. Having seen that all was in order, Nicholas bade him good night, and trudged away through gusty darkness to the inn. It had been a hot, damp day, with a cloudy sky and occasional brief squalls of rain. Yet Phoebe had declared her certainty that it would be clear by morning. "We have had rather less of sunshine and more of lowering weather than was our due these last seasons," Nicholas had heard her saying to Dolly. "But it is my belief that now we are to have fair skies once more." As Nicholas went homeward, he looked up at the starless blackness overhead, listened to the intermittent sighing of the wind, and made sure that Phoebe's prophecy was for once mistaken. He was done with the Betsy, and what a long task it had been to make the worn-out little tub into a staunch, safe vessel. Now that it was ended, he felt suddenly that he was very tired. He did not know that he had begun to look more gaunt and haggard even than had his uncle during the last strain of effort before illness came. He had not noted that people were glancing at him anxiously, that Dolly and Phoebe whispered about him when he was not looking. He was only conscious of how good it was to feel that he was done with the Betsy at last and could stumble upstairs to bed. He slept heavily and awoke, realizing that the loud disturbance which had aroused him, the pounding upon his door, must have been going on for some minutes. He sat up in the darkness, blinking, then tumbled headlong out of his bed and into his clothes. Of the words which Caleb Harmon was shouting, only a portion had really reached his sleepy mind, but they were sufficient. "Fire! On the wharves!" As he ran down the street and saw the dull red reflection on the sky turn to flaming reality beyond the shipyards, he knew at a single glance what was amiss. Nothing but burning oil could make those long banners of crimson and orange which streamed before the rising wind. As he came beyond the buildings, he saw the Betsy, her bow and forecastle wrapped in a garment of flame, spouting black smoke and fire from the forward hatches. She was tugging at the cables which held her, for the gusty breezes of the early evening had risen now to a stiff north wind. Even before he reached the wharf, people had come pouring out of the little houses which crowded down to the shore so close beyond the Drury docks. They were attempting to fling water upon the blaze, but the whole fore portion of the ship was a seething furnace which it was almost impossible to approach. "The fire just burst out of her all of a sudden, as she might be a volcano," John Ewing was trying to cry in Nicholas's ear. At the moment he paid little heed, since checking the spread of the blaze was more important than its origin. Such water as could be thrown upon her planking disappeared instantly in a hiss and a puff of steam. If it reached the oil-fed conflagration within, it only served to spread the flame. There was no more hope of the fire's sparing the Betsy than if she were made of paper. "We had best try to save the houses," Caleb Harmon said at Nicholas's elbow. The high wind was carrying long gusts of flame and bits of burning rope and canvas to lodge them upon the clustering roofs not many yards away. If fire once gained foothold in the close-built little village, who could tell what wholesale destruction would sweep over it before morning? Even as Nicholas looked, a slope of old shingles on the nearest cottage burst into a blaze, but was quenched by the owner with a splash of water. Nicholas nodded. For the Betsy there was nothing to be done. With hasty orders he got the men in line to pass buckets up from the harbor edge and empty them first upon the nearest roofs, then, when these were saturated, to move a little farther. But as they toiled, the little brig lying doomed at the dock suddenly changed to a vindictive demon, sending forth ever-renewed blasts of fire which threatened minute by minute to render all their effort vain. "We should cut her hawsers and let her drift down the harbor," Nicholas cried in Caleb's ear, for the roar of the flames almost drowned their voices. Caleb nodded. "The tide will carry her out in spite of the wind," he shouted back. "She should drift clear of the waterside and run ashore on Branscomb Head. There's nothing else will save the town." The two seized axes and fell to chopping with all their might. The oil had been stored in the forehold, so that, so far, only half the ship was on fire. She had not been anchored, but was moored to the wharf by 4 big hawsers, of which the bow cable was almost already burned through. 1, 2, they snapped under the blows of the axes and the strain of the plunging Betsy. Nicholas and Caleb attacked the stern cable, so that the line amidships could hold her steady until the last, but the strain upon it was too heavy. It parted with a crack like a pistol shot, leaving the stern cable holding her so that she swung about in the wind, heading straight down upon the threatened warehouses, sheds, and crowded cottages directly to leeward. The tide was pulling her seaward, but Held as she was, the wind was having its desperate way. Caleb Harmon had dropped his axe with a groan of helpless dismay, which rose suddenly to a cry of agonized remonstrance. Nicholas had wielded his blade with a last frantic stroke, and as the line parted, he jumped across the intervening space, caught the Betsy's helm, and attempted to bring the bow of the drifting ship around to face the harbor mouth. The strong hand of the tide seized her and gave her greater and greater steerage way. She rounded out into the channel as though she were under sail, and went sweeping down the harbor, a vivid, streaming torch of destruction. Nicholas, in sole charge of his strange craft, stood at the tiller, easing and guiding her so that she would follow exactly the deepest channel. He was willing to run no risk of getting aground while the Betsy was still within such distance of the scattered houses along the shore that a leap of wind-carried fire might drop blazing sparks upon the roofs. He could see the cottages, strung out beside the water, showing clear in the wild crimson flare of their passing. The breeze was steady and flew the long flames out to starboard. Had they eddied fore and aft, his position on the afterdeck would have been impossible to hold. He knew every rock and shoal of that harbor where he had swum and fished and sailed since he was 7 years old. The tumult of excitement which had possessed him had grown now so tense that it had brought him into a curious state of calm. Overwrought as he was, his hands were steady and his head was clear. He felt that his strength would compass any conceivable purpose. It seemed as though he were standing upon the clouds. He noted how sharply outlined and unreal the houses looked, lit by the weird light as they flashed by. How unnatural were the white, strained faces of the people who ran down to the water to watch them pass. He thought that he heard faint sounds of voices calling to him, but nothing was really audible but the roar of the flames. "When the fire reaches the mainmast," he told himself, "it will be time for me to go overboard." They had swept beyond the last of the village now, and the jagged black line of rocks against the sky showed that they were drifting parallel with Branscomb Head. The flames had seemed, for a little, to be gaining small headway. He did not realize that they had been creeping aft, below, rather than along the windswept deck. Nicholas was looking upward, watching a curl of fire creep up the foremast, when, with a sudden bellowing blast, a great column of flame shot up through the hatch just before him. Its glare blinded him. The rush of hot air almost stunned him, but he had the strength and clearness of purpose still to swing the tiller and head the Betsy straight toward the rock-ribbed shore. A lick of flame reached out, seared the skin of his arm, and set fire to his sleeve, just as he set his foot upon the port rail and leaped as far outward as he could into the black water. It seemed strange to be dropped all at once into the quiet darkness after the blinding and deafening uproar upon the brig. He struck out with long, easy strokes, quite comfortable and happy along the warm swells, although the salt water stung a little where it touched his burned arm. He rose to a wave just in time to see the Betsy strike with a shattering crash, sending up a geyser of sparks and a mast-high pillar of flame. A moment later there was an explosion in her hold, echoing all along the wall of rock, casting upward a shower of bits of burning wood, which dropped hissing about him as he lay in the water. The tide was beginning to drift him seaward. He must put forth all his effort if he were to reach shore. It was a longer pull than he had thought, and a fiercer battle against the force of the tide. He could feel that the current was growing stronger and was setting inshore. This, he knew, was bearing him to greater danger, for he had reached the point where the tide race swept northward past the very outermost rock of Branscomb Head. If he failed to make land now, he would be carried out to sea. His breath was coming short, as a swimmer's does who is near the end of his power. He struggled and fought on, rose to see a mass of rock close before him, sank into a hollow to believe that he had drifted by it, and rose again to catch at a jutting ledge that was seaweed covered and cut his hands. The tide jerked and snatched at him as he clung desperately. Another wave lifted him higher, and he snatched at a better hold. The third raised him bodily so that he crawled out upon the firm surface under its slimy, wet cushion. He lay full length, panting to fill his empty lungs. Loud in his ears was the sound of the fast-sweeping current plunging through the last scattered boulders at the extremity of Branscomb Head. He lay inert for a long time, too much exhausted to think of anything beyond breath and rest. At last, however, he sat up. Far away, it seemed, was the dull glare of the Betsy burning quietly now, like a spent bonfire. Overhead was a black sky growing gray to the morning. All about him were black rocks and black lapping water. He and the brig might have been the only two in the whole universe. He sat quietly, his arms about his knees, watching the daylight come across the sea. The high wind of the night had torn the clouds asunder, but they still hung everywhere, save above the horizon to the eastward. Nicholas thought that he had never seen such brilliant beauty as showed in that stretch of dawn-illumined sky. As Phoebe had said, the weather was clearing at last. Below the edge of the dark curtain, the awakening light was like green, transparent glass, reflected in a widening band of smooth water where calm had fallen. The nearest clouds were drifting swiftly above him. A brisk morning breeze was sweeping the sky clean of them. It passed over his head and then dropped to that complete hush which only early morning knows. The eternal restlessness of the sea lapped in ripples at his feet, while its faint movement ran in watered patterns all over the vast silvery expanse before him. There were left smooth patches here and there, like irregular bits of broken looking-glass. Out toward that eastern rim of the silent world, the Jocasta had taken her way. Those smiling waters knew the secret of where she had gone, yet would never tell him. That clear sky had seen her pass, and whither, yet would guard the mystery forever. "Oh, Michael, Michael!" he cried aloud. There was no one now to see or hear him. He could let pain master him at last. Again and again he cried out the name of his vanished friend. "Michael! Michael!" The tempest of anguish that swept over him lasted not many minutes, and presently was gone. That serene, clearing sky, that majestic greatness of the vast waters before him, held some message of steadying comfort. The sea stretched from him to Michael, to the Jocasta, whithersoever they had fared. Though they should never come back, he could still stand beside that shining water and be near them. The morning light had brightened so that now the whole world about him was visible. He turned about to look back toward the town. The rough-hewn outline of Branscomb Head stood stark against the sky. By a curve in its rugged length, part of the harbor was hidden so that he saw only a portion of its glassy surface, a single corner of the crowd of houses clustering at the edge of the glassy water. Beyond, he could see the softly rising hills, marked with squares of yellowing fields in different shades where oats, hay, or buckwheat had grown. The folds of the slope held close-growing woods. Towards the summits were stretches of bare pasture ground, streaked out by the outcropping of rock ledges with here and there a solitary maple, oak, or pine. The flitting shadow of the last cloud in the sky passed over them and was gone. It looked in that brilliant morning light like a world new made. Nicholas seemed to regard it with eyes that had never really seen clearly before. This was home. This was his land. The love he had for it was so much a part of him as to partake of his whole being, bone and sinew as well as heart. His ship, his friend. What he felt for them was not like this. To that brief stretch of fields, hills, and houses, to the greater things for which it stood, He must forever give the best he had. Sorrow shrank into a little place alongside that greater knowledge. Whatever came to him, or failed to come, he must carry an intrepid heart to meet what was still before him. The tide had turned and was now running in past the headland. He slipped off the rock into the water and drew himself with long strokes to the shore. Dripping, he climbed out upon a granite ledge and scrambled to the summit of the headland. Once he looked back over his shoulder to see that the red ball of the sun was lifting above the water. Then he set forth upon his journey homeward, turning his face to the work which was still waiting. End of chapter 7.